Welcome to today's episode of Falling to Freedom, where addiction ends and faith begins, the weekly podcast that brings thoughtful, informed, and challenging discussions about addiction to the forefront of everyone's minds. We join our host now, Chad LaComb, for today's topic.
All right, well, today we have a special guest, Nicole Clear, and she works for the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Our topic today is when addiction turns deadly. A coroner's perspective. Nicole is a Riverside County coroner, and so up close and personal with death. And for this podcast, you know, as it relates to drug and alcohol addiction and what role that plays with it. But I thought we could just start by having you just kind of share a little bit, about your job, Nicole, and also, like, what does a coroner do? I mean, I think we all have the picture in the mind, you know, with just the body in the morgue or maybe an autopsy, but I'm pretty sure there's more to it than that. So if you wanted to just go ahead and share with us, we'd love to hear it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah.
So I have been a coroner since the year 2000. Mm-hmm. There's a lot getting into it that I was not aware of. So of course we have our education, and it varies widely in our office, because there's nothing that you can learn in a book or even in a classroom that's going to prepare you for what we do. Mm-hmm. What we do specifically is we kind of wait around and wait for people to pass away, you know?
Okay.
We have our offices and we wait there. And then when a phone call comes in, it's law enforcement, it's a doctor at a hospital or a nurse at a hospital. It could be a paramedic, a fireman out in the field. It comes in through primarily first responders. Sometimes we get calls from mortuaries. Sometimes we get calls from transport companies, from mortuaries that are just seeing or feeling something that's not quite right. So every death is not a coroner matter. When we receive that phone call, we evaluate if it's something that is a topic or a matter where we have to get involved.
Like if there's an investigation needed?
Yes.
Like somebody dying on hospice wouldn't require a coroner?
Well, yes and no, because we evaluate if there's anything suspicious. And suspicious does not necessarily mean criminal. Mm-hmm. So let's just say that Grandpa hasn't been to the doctor in 20 years. We can guess what that might be about and what, lifestyle and whatnot. But we don't have a doctor outside that's been treating him that can say, yeah, he had heart disease, or he had I diagnosed a tumor 20 years ago and he just didn't act on it. So that is a suspicious death. Let's say we take that same grandpa and he's fit as a fiddle and just was at his doctor last week and doesn't have any health issues, but he's hanging the Christmas lights outside, and so he falls off the ladder. Well, did he have a massive cardiac event? Did he have a stroke? Did something happen medically? Or did he just lose his balance, and his injury when he hit the ground, was that the cause of death? So these are things that we don't have someone somewhere to give an opinion. And that's another thing, another area that even after autopsy, even after we've done our due diligence with toxicology and all the scientific testing, a cause of death is really just a best opinion. So when we receive that phone call, we evaluate if it's something that we need to get involved in. Sometimes hospice deaths are a little fishy. Let's just say that the hospice nurse arrives, and yesterday when she was there, this person was actively passing, but the medication levels don't look appropriate today for what they were yesterday. So did the family help them along? Were they able to overdose themselves? I had a hospice case called in just for a clearance, and at the end of the call, an officer that was at the house got on the phone. He says, "Okay, well, thank you so much, and what do you want me to do with the gun?" And I said, "What gun?" They just told me my fella died from his history of terminal diagnosis of cancer. But he also had an extra hole in his head now because he didn't want to wait it out for the cancer to take him. He went in, that's called a suicide. That is not a hospice death. So again, hospice deaths do need to be called in and evaluated and those kinds of things. Obviously, if there's something suspicious and criminal, we're definitely getting involved. If there's something high profile, if it's a child, even if it's a sick child who was born with leukemia or some kind of Hodgkin's disease or something like this, and that the death is anticipated, there's a child involved, and so we have to go out and examine and get involved. Obviously, so we have a classification series that when that phone call comes in, we have to kind of fit it in one of those little boxes. And I call it NASHU. It's an acronym for my categories. So it's natural. Is it a natural death that needs my attention? Does it sound like an accidental death? So NA. Is it a suicide? Could it possibly be? The H is for homicide, and the U is for undetermined.
Unknown.
I just don't know. Unknown.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we can kind of narrow it down to a couple of those, and we know we need to get involved. But
I'm just curious because based on those boxes that you just gave, where would you put an overdose?
accident. So accident is, there's subcategories in accident. There's accident like miscellaneous falls, like falling off the ladder. But then there's traffic accident, which is completely different, still under the accident heading. But there are traffic accidents that result from a natural event, like a massive heart attack, or an overdose first, and then we crash the car. So,
Or a suicide.
Or a suicide. And I had that. I had gone to make a notification and thought that I was going to be informing them of a traffic accident death, and the spouse let me hear the voicemail that was left during this event, and it was intentional.
Wow.
So yeah, so that's what the coroner does. Now that's on the death specific side. We also determine the manner, mode, and cause of death. Our bureau does. So is it, what is it in the NASHU? That's the manner. Is it natural, accidental, suicidal, homicide, undetermined, traffic specific? And then on top of that, we are responsible for identifying that body. And, you know, here in Southern California, we have a lot of people who are not from here, but they come in and die here. And then in Riverside County, we are the 10th largest county in the country. And because of how we are geographically situated, there's a lot of people who die here that also don't live here. They're out of county, just coming from San Diego to Las Vegas or, you know, any which way. So we have our work cut out for us a lot. So we have to identify this person as best as we can, as fast as we can. And then we have to find their family and notify them. And in Riverside County, we are required to do so in person. It doesn't matter the hour of the day. We are expected that once we know who this person is, and if we have any of our resources that would lead us to them being a local resident or having family local, we get up and we go out and we knock on that door.
You, the coroner.
Yes, the coroner. Which is why in this county we are also sworn peace officers and armed. And we do go through, even though our expertise is science and medical, we go through it's post-certified training in the state of California, where every 2 years I have to re-qualify, whether it's with my gun, with my baton, with handcuffing, arrest, search and seizure procedures. It's a lot. We wear a lot of hats. We also, when we respond out to the field, are responsible for protecting property. So anything that's on them, let's say jewelry or foreign objects in or on their body or in their pockets, I have to secure that. If they're in a residence, I need to secure that residence and make sure that it's only releasable to the legal next of kin, which is also difficult at times to
There's a lot more
determine.
going on in the coroner's office than I realized.
Yes, we wear a lot of hats. Yes.
Well, let me ask you a question. You know, within the cases that you see, I mean, I don't know how many you see a week or a month, but
In my time there, the cases that I personally handle in a year,
or
I
just the
think
office.
The office, things have changed quite a bit, and so we are not. 20-something years ago, we used to handle every hospice case as if it were a case, and everyone required a full report. We wanted to know what they were wearing and who was in the house and what position they were laying in, and you know. Now it's a screening process, and so we don't have all of that in our data collection. And there are other cases like that. However, we are still handling, I think last I checked, which was probably 2 years ago, I think we hit 15,500. And I want to say that was maybe toward the end of the COVID thing.
Was that for the year?
For the office for the year.
For the year, okay. 15,500 for the year. So how many or what percentage of the deaths that your office, handles, investigates, would you say is drug or alcohol related? I mean, you don't have to give a specific number. But
Right.
generally, what would you say would be a close approximation of the percentage that is drug and alcohol related?
To be very conservative, because I don't have those numbers in front of me, I would say that it's over half.
Over 50% of the deaths of those 15,500 were drug and alcohol related.
Yes. Well, that particular year, the last year I checked, we had a lot of other diagnoses, like during that COVID window.
Yeah, of course.
But still, I think that the overdose rate was, of the cases that we became involved in, were likely over 50%.
Yeah, and I don't think when you think about addiction leading to death, most people would probably think overdose.
Yes.
But that's not it, right?
No.
I mean, it's like you got overdose, you have, drug driving, traffic related, you have crimes that are committed that end in homicide that were drug or alcohol related. I mean, right?
That's right.
I mean, what other things would you...
You also have natural deaths that are drug related. And so
Really?
a lot of people are surprised that, you may not have a toxicity level, or your toxicology might not come back at a level that is fatal.
When you say toxicology, I'm sorry, you guys do a drug, like a blood panel or something on the body to see what substances are there? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, we send to an outside lab. We send them samples of urine, blood, and vitreous fluid. Vitreous fluid is the fluid that we extract from the eye, and that really tends to keep a more accurate level longer. So our bodies metabolize, and even post-mortem, even after we die, there's it's not a fermentation process, it's a decomposition process. So even if you pass away without any drugs or alcohol in your system, your body develops alcohol. So we're able to kind of split the hairs between, like, if you're a chronic alcoholic or if it's an alcohol overdose.
Interesting.
So it depends, it's a lot of calculations and math. However, there are deaths that are natural deaths that are from chronic use of methamphetamine, alcohol, heroin, cocaine. I mean, you name it.
Like what?
There's heart disease.
Heart-related
There's
stuff.
liver failure. And liver failure is an interesting one, too, because a lot of times we see people who have never had a drink in their life with severe cirrhosis. And the cirrhosis is more often than not, if it's not alcohol or drug related, related to the treatment or the condition of having diabetes. So, and the only way to tell the difference there is on a microscopic level. So, and then of course toxicology, where we're
And do you guys
evaluating.
do that on the microscopic level?
We have a histologist that comes in and looks at little tiny paper thin slides of different tissues and can identify different things that look different under that microscope. But that's not my forte.
Yeah, but I guess what you're saying is you can tell from the autopsy if somebody has had chronic drug or alcohol use.
Yes.
I mean, because I'm thinking, how many times do people die of a heart attack? And it's just, they just think, oh, they just died of a heart attack. But that was drug related because the person had been using methamphetamine for 10 years or 12 years. And I guess, most people don't think that you can die from it, right? From methamphetamine, but...
There are a lot of people who would like to argue that you cannot die from methamphetamine or that you cannot die from any given thing. But the thing with the cause of death, the death certificate shows a terminal event. So if we say that it's a methamphetamine overdose, let's say, as a cause of death on the death certificate, the implication is that this chemical has caused your heart to cease, or your brain to cease, your lungs to fill up with edema or fluid. So it's not saying like, oh, too much drugs, you just drop dead. It's saying the implication is that there's a chemical that has caused a chain reaction for your body to stop walking and talking and breathing. So we do get a lot of people who are very upset with the generality of our causes of death, but and a lot of people also want this very complete history and background of the, let's say something that is completely natural, let's say a cancer. They want to know, they want the information that maybe a geneticist would provide. We don't do that. We are talking about a terminal event on the last date that this person was alive. And so this thing happened on this day. If it's genetic, or if your children are at risk to have it, or, any other, if it's environmental, that's out of our wheelhouse. We're just talking about terminal events.
Okay. In your experience, what is something about addictions effects on the body that maybe the general public isn't aware of? What would be something from your perspective, seeing this, that maybe the general public wouldn't be aware of?
So there are signs, they always say, like, if I win the lottery, I'm not going to say anything, but there will be signs. But the opposite is also true. The drugs and alcohol really take a toll on the body. And as I kind of briefly referred to earlier, the damage to the liver, there's a buildup in the heart, and there's hugely enlarged hearts. Your heart should be about the size of a man's fist, but we get hearts that are maybe like the size of 2 or 3 of those fists. And it's just kind of like a congestive heart failure, where there's this blockage and this malfunction, and everything's backed up, and that muscle is just stretched to its limits to try to do its job. But and as it's working against resistance and blockage, it kind of expands, and it throws everything off. Okay. So that, and then of course we've got something very common with like methamphetamine use is the loss of teeth. And if you are talking about the mouth specifically, I'm not sure if you're aware, but when you have a tooth infection or a dental issue, the infection from our mouths circulates directly to our hearts and does damage. So it's not like it gets flushed out and works its way down to our toes and back. It's a direct link. It's that 18-inch.
Is that why the dental hygienist is always telling you to take care of the plaque and all the stuff, because it can cause heart disease?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
and
that's interesting.
Painful. I mean, really, it can really. So that's one of the signs of drug use is the loss of teeth. It's methamphetamine specifically is because it's this upper that causes constant movement and jittery and grinding, and so there's different signs that, like, say someone who's using methamphetamine that would have over like alcohol. Alcohol doesn't cause the grinding; it causes just teeth to fall out or rot. So there are different physical signs that we look for, and then we verify what we think. We don't guess. That's the big thing.
Right.
We don't guess in our office. We can, based on history and experience, we can say it's probably this or that. But we wait till the science comes in and supports what we think might have been. But that's something that a lot of people assume, that we are making assumptions because of their lifestyle or income or class structure. They think we're just going to go, oh, this one's just another one of those. Not at all. Not at all. My unsheltered folks are just as important to me as the people who live in the nicest homes. And I personally, they're my family. They're my babies until I have an answer. And I think that is something that people don't expect from the public, doesn't expect from us. They think that we get so jaded that we just poo-poo it off. No, we wait for the real answers. We don't guess. But again, there are physical signs that different things contribute to.
You said something that made me think, like death is the great equalizer.
Yes.
Right?
Does
it doesn't
not
matter.
Discriminate.
No, it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor,
That's right.
High IQ, low IQ, born into royalty, or it doesn't matter.
That's
Death
right.
is the great equalizer. And when we're talking about addiction and death, I think it's the same thing, right? I mean, a lot of times people just associate addiction with low income,
Right.
from the other side of the tracks, and that's just not the case.
It's not.
I mean, and that's one of the points of this podcast is just letting people know this is a whole of society problem.
Yes.
It's everyone. I mean, there's doctors, law enforcement, teachers, politicians. I mean, everybody can and is affected by this or can be bound by this. And in your office, I mean, I imagine you would see that clearly.
Yes.
Because you see the end of it.
I see drug addiction, how it, obviously I see the final chapter of a life. I see the last day or the last, the final thing. And it's interesting to me because I have found that there is so much familial support in the trenches of homeless encampments for one another that I don't see a lot in the more affluent places that have a similar cause of death, maybe the same cause of death. So when you are talking about how death doesn't discriminate and addiction doesn't discriminate, that's true. Now, we as people, I think, tend to discriminate. And so it's interesting that in the more affluent areas, how there is, not always, but there seems to be more shame, less help, more anger, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there's more help, there's more support, there's more concern, there's more emotion. It's really an interesting dynamic to witness.
Yeah, I could see that. That being in the, being in the trenches together kind of brings you together and you understand. But I think also probably in the affluent neighborhoods, they're trying to probably put on a persona or a facade and pretend that things are a certain way.
Yes.
Obviously, if you're homeless and you're down in the gutter at that point in your life, it's like you're not trying to pretend. Right. There is no pretending at that point.
Right. It just seems to be more authentic, more genuine. But again, that's a sweeping stereotype because I have a personal friend, so of course I have years of experience on duty, but I also have personal friends and contacts that are most recently last year, whom are very, very good, kind people who are gainfully employed. They are as white picket fences as you can imagine. And their son made a wrong decision when he was about 15 years old and tried a little something that he couldn't stop trying. He the first time was what it took to be addicted. And he battled it for, I want to say, 7 years before he succumbed to his addiction. And it was tragic. Because, you hate to classify people, oh, these are good people or those aren't or whatever, but these are truly, really good people, loving people, people of faith, people of community, and did everything right as far as parenting, as far as counseling, as far as tough love and, breaking down love. And they did everything they possibly could. But this sweet kid of theirs, and he really was a sweet, sweet young man, he just made a bad choice this one time and couldn't get out from under it.
Wow. Yeah, I think stories like that are really what we're trying to get across as well, that this is not an isolated thing. This doesn't matter, the upbringing, the neighborhood,
right.
Doesn't matter any of that kind of stuff. It affects, we like to say it's the dirty little secret that every family deals with, but nobody wants to talk about, because we believe strongly, and we haven't met anybody that has said anything to the contrary, that every person has someone, if not in their immediate family, their extended family that has dealt with addiction or is dealing with addiction. It's just that widespread.
Absolutely.
And so opening up the conversation and talking about it, I think, is healthy, shedding some light on it. Absolutely. And letting people realize they're not the only ones going through this. Other people are going through it, a lot of other people. So.
And that's true. It really does affect more people than we realize. We put a face on certain, people that, we kind of could see that coming. There's a gentleman who lives in the city I live in, and he was a very active teacher and coach at a local high school. He had an accident. He was put onto prescription pain medication for his legitimate injuries and became addicted, and he now lives in the street. And he is an absolute addict. And it is heart-wrenching to see because I know how he lived before.
Yeah, we had a guest on here, not too long ago, and this guest, when I think he was 16 or 17 years old, had an injury, and they gave him prescription drugs, became addicted to them.
Yes.
Within a year, he's full-blown addict, heroin addict on the streets. It's like, wow, how even just legal prescription drugs for a legitimate injury can lead to full-blown addiction. It's crazy.
It is. And people don't realize that, a lot of people have this impression that addicts are weak, or they are, I think weakness is probably the thing that's associated with them, but that's really not the case. When we're talking about chemicals, whether they are illicit or whether they are prescribed, whether they're FDA approved or whether they are made in somebody's garage, they are changing our bodies on a cellular level. And so we can become so dependent on them that our bodies will need that thing, whatever it is, more than food, more than water, more than anything else that you can imagine. It would be like asking them, this person that somebody might consider weak, to, okay, just don't breathe again, okay? Just for the rest of your life, you could just stop breathing. That would be great. It's just that simple. Just decide. You just decide. Just stop breathing. No. That's the effect that drugs have on some people. That they have changed their chemistry at that base level, and they can't just decide out of it.
So, Nicole, you said better than 50% of the deaths that you see are drug and alcohol related, but within that number could be many different substances.
Right.
Is there one that you would say you see more often than others, or is it kind of pretty balanced?
It's not balanced. I would say up until the last handful of years, it was primarily methamphetamine. Okay. Methamphetamine is a stimulant, and so it taxes the heart muscle. So in addition to occlusions and buildup and all the other things that come along with it, you've really exhausted that muscle. And if we only have a finite number of beats in our lifetime, you've just accelerated or used up a whole bunch of those tokens with this stimulant.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Right. So, but in the last handful of years, I can't remember what year I read. I was reading the Journal of American Medicine, and it was JAMA. I'm pretty sure it was JAMA. I was reading for the first time in history, just in the last 5 years or 5 to 10 years or so, that for the last 100 years, heart disease in general has been the leading cause of death. Natural heart disease, predominantly in North America. We have a lot of saturated foods with fats and things, and our lifestyles are not supportive of hard work and pulling water up from wells and tending to fields and animals. So we have developed this huge propensity between McDonald's and cheeseburgers and everything everywhere for atherosclerosis in our cardiac system. I mean, it's just a buildup, blockage, hardening and thickening of our whole system. So, but in the last handful of years, there's been a paradigm shift from the first time in history away from natural causes of death being the leading cause to drug-related, overdose-related, chronic use-related death. So, and it's in recent years more specific to fentanyl. Fentanyl, and then more recently, we have come to learn that everything is dirty. So marijuana is going to maybe have a little bit of sprinkling of fentanyl in it. Makes it more addicting, makes the customer want to revisit the dealer because that's really potent stuff as opposed to a dispensary or some other person. We're seeing fentanyl being included in injectables, edibles, smokables, so every which way you can imagine of taking, ingesting, applying, injecting a drug, we are finding that fentanyl is part of everything now.
So you're saying, prior to maybe the last 3 to 5 years, it was predominantly methamphetamine.
Yes.
Through, incidents with heart attacks and congestive failure, those types of things.
Yes.
More recently related to fentanyl, the deaths more related to fentanyl. So you hear a term drug poisoning a lot. And I read a statistic about, the high incidence of drug poisoning, and it was implying, I think, what you're saying right there, where substances are introduced into others, and I mean, you could say the person overdosed, but it wasn't intentional, right? It wasn't like, well, probably no overdose is intentional, but the person knows what they're taking. They just took too much. In these instances, the person is taking ecstasy, or they're taking something that they think is one thing, it has fentanyl in it, and they end up overdosing, but not realizing they were taking it. And I think that is called drug poisoning. Is that accurate? Or
we don't use that term, but it seems a logical rationale. I will say that a lot of people question the existence of fentanyl to begin with. Fentanyl is a fantastic and effective drug in controlled environments. It was made for extreme trauma. You get in a horrible car accident, or you are, have gunshots, or you're exposed to an explosion of some sort, or you fire. I mean, you catch on fire. Fentanyl is very effective in a hospital setting. It was created to deal with extreme and excruciating pain. So fentanyl itself is not the enemy. The problem is that we have the FDA approved fentanyl, whether it's by patch form, something that the hospital administers injection into IV. That is not the problem. The problem is the street level fentanyl, and that is made. Who knows? We're thinking, or we're guessing that it's coming in from out of country, probably through our southern borders. But anymore, it's anyone's guess. That is not calibrated. Now I'm gonna
the same potency.
It's very potent, but whereas let's say that you have a pill from the hospital, a fentanyl pill, which you wouldn't have. It's not something that they would prescribe for you to take home. Patches, yes, but we don't get the patches in the street as much. So,
but it has a certain amount.
It has a certain amount.
And you know how much is in it.
Exactly. And if you cut that thing in half, it's going to have exactly as much in this half as it does in this half. You cut those in half, this quarter is going to have as much as that quarter, and that quarter, and that quarter. It's all equally distributed. The street level stuff, we're getting cases where they're like, I don't know why they died. We split a pill. I'm still here. My partner is deceased. And it's because there's not that distribution, or that in the manufacturing, the consistency, right? So maybe the surviving person had the half of that pill that only had 3 particles in it, whereas the other person might have had 10,000 particles in it. And you don't know what you're going to get when you get it off the street. And you should actually never have that particular drug in your possession at all, because you are gambling every time. I've heard that the effects are fantastic if you survive it, but even fentanyl at this point is not the greatest concern either. We've got super methamphetamine that's out there, and other super drugs that are even more powerful. And I think that we're going to continue to see the rise of illicit drug-related deaths, whether it's from chronic use or from an overdose, an acute amount on a particular day.
You're seeing super drugs out there.
Yeah.
That's the first I've heard of that.
Yeah, you
So
can.
just the same thing, but like on a whole nother level as far as potency.
Yep.
I mean, I heard, like, as an example, marijuana, back in the 80s had like this much THC, and now it's like a crazy amount of THC that is in marijuana now. So kind of the same thing with these other drugs, just super, super potent.
Right. And so I think with the marijuana, because it's still a natural based thing, it's genetically modified, but still natural-ish. Whereas like fentanyl is a synthetic drug. Even at its best level in a hospital setting, it's still a synthetic drug. And so someone somewhere thought it was a good idea to make it more potent. because that's not something that just grew out of a tree because
Sure.
there's something in the water. And on that topic,
Yeah.
everything is dirty. Everything is dirty right now.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. You know, I had a friend that she had an injury. She was, like 90 pounds, little tiny woman, and her neighbor who had had a car accident a year before says, "Hey, I've got some prescription hydrocodone. Let me give you one. I mean, you're in so much pain." Nothing illegal about that. So he gives her a pill. She's aware that she's tiny. She cuts that thing, I want to say, in quarters, and she took a quarter of the pill. She almost died. She was hospitalized for 3 days. Her pill had fentanyl in it. And so with much investigation, they were able to figure out that this gentleman who shared his prescription medication from a prescription medical bottle had no idea that within his house, his teenage son had been getting into his prescribed hydrocodone. And the kid was like, well, shoot, Dad's going to notice that the level is different. So the kid replaced the actual prescribed pills with street level pills that look just like them. They're the same color. They've got the same
Oh, my
imprint.
goodness.
So he put the street level thing in, pills in the bottle. This guy knows that this is his prescription. They're probably weaker than they were, a year ago or whenever he was prescribed them. So he's not going to hurt or kill his neighbor with his weakened
Wow.
painkiller.
It's a good thing she only took a portion of it.
Right. She would have died, no doubt. Yeah. So it's so readily available out in the streets and at the schools even. I had a very good friend of mine recently she's an RN, and she had to rush to her son at the hospital because someone at school traded him a cookie. He had cookies in his lunchbox and traded him a gummy for a cookie. And that gummy was not fentanyl. It was so high and so potent in THC that it made this kid instantly ill. And I mean, violently ill. It was horrible.
The fentanyl issue seems to be, of great concern for first responders as well and law enforcement. I mean, you see like a lot of people, they're wearing gloves now, and I mean, because they don't even want to touch it because it's so potent, and if you get it on you, it could actually, do harm to you. You guys see that?
Yes, we do. We all are issued Narcan, and we are trained in how to administer the Narcan to dogs. We go into homes, and I'm sure you saw the video of the officer out of San Diego County who, I think he ran his arm along a counter that fentanyl powder had been on, and he immediately dropped, and he was in seizures. I mean, had he had any medical issues, he probably would have died right there as well. He survived it, but the issue with fentanyl, let's say I go out to a case and again, I'm not sure why this person is deceased. I'm there to examine his body and then take him back to my office so that we can do an internal exam just to make sure that what we are finding internally or by toxicological screenings is consistent with what we saw in the field, with what I saw out there. And so I'm in this very, very tight, little tiny bathroom with just a commode, and there's powder and there's a credit card, so I mean, is that cocaine? That the powder's in lines, and I'm in this very little tiny enclosed space with this body and this powder, and do I have a cut on my elbow? You start thinking like, okay, I mean, am I breathing too hard? And finally I took pictures in there, and I grabbed him by the ankles and pulled him out because I said, you know what? Whatever was on or around his body there, hopefully my camera got it so that I don't miss anything. But I could not be in there. I cannot put myself at risk because this fella. And sure enough, he actually ended up, it was a fentanyl-related death. Just shocking. I mean, there were children, and they were caring for their grandchildren in that house. And this is not, isolated to teenagers and young adults. This was a grandfather who had his daughter living in the house. So this is an older man with an adult daughter and her children living in the house. And his addiction was the higher calling. He had to respond to that.
Yeah, that seems to be consistent with addiction. It becomes the most important thing in a person's life.
That's right.
And that's why I say getting free from addiction is simple. It's not easy, But it's simple. Something has to become more important
Yes.
than that addiction, because that becomes the most important thing in your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even at that, I mean, truly, I don't know the genre of your listeners and your watchers, but I truly believe that if not by the grace of God, it's not possible. We can't just decide like, okay, I'm going to be fine. I'm not going to take that drug again. It's just going to be just as simple as it never taking a breath again. That's all I have to do. It's just never breathe again. And that's how I liken the struggle to break addiction. But by the grace of God, I and even at that, I don't know the physical withdrawals and conditions that people go through, because again, I deal with death. I don't see the suffering of the living, unless of course it applies to their families and affects their families, which it does. It absolutely does. We've had cases where people have broken homes because of their attachment to the addiction or to the drug, and how that can isolate family members. It can put family members at risk. We had a case several years ago in a local city here. Well, they're all local cities. I work in this county, where a young man killed his grandmother who was living with them because of years after he battled with drugs, he developed a psychosis. And in that psychosis, I don't know if he thought grandma grew horns or what it was, but to my knowledge, he was not under the influence at that time, but the post effects of drug use earlier on caused him to have a paranoid attack, and he killed his grandmother. It was horrible.
Wow. Tragic. One last question on fentanyl. When a person dies from fentanyl, whether accidental or on purpose, what actually is happening that kills the person? Is it the heart stops, or is it?
It's a whole combination of things, and so it truly is splitting hairs to kind of try to figure out what happened first. A lot of times they can have stroke-like symptoms where they have maybe a brain bleed. They can have more times than not, it's a cardiac event where it causes that heart muscle to just seize. Sometimes it causes a pulmonary edema. Now, not fentanyl specifically, because fentanyl deaths are typically so fast that there's not enough time to build up a fluid or have edema. It's just, I don't want to be too graphic, but we have this expulsion of blood from the mouth as opposed to like foam or froth. The best way in layman's terms that I can explain the pulmonary edema that happens with an overdose, like methamphetamine that stimulates, is that if you've ever taken like a wet kitchen sponge and you have squeeze, and then you didn't put any soap on it, but all the soap that used to be, you've used it before, starts frothing out of this thing. So in that specific case, which is more likely methamphetamine, or sometimes cocaine, the brain is so hyped out, I guess, hyped up, and it's giving all these signals, these electric signals to different parts of the body all at once. So the heart is just going crazy, and then those lungs are, and you get this like foaming or frothing of the surfactant that's in the lungs. It's this kind of a slippery substance, sticky substance that coats every portion of the inside of your lung that bubbles up and froths out. And so that's another visible sign when I go out to a case. Do they have foam, purge, froth? Did they vomit? Did they have blood coming out of their mouth or nose? And it kind of leads the investigation and kind of helps us to, we're going to test for everything, but it's likely to be something that's associated with that particular response. But that's basically what happens. There's, at the end of the day, whether it's falling off a ladder, whether it's a traffic collision, whether it's a drug overdose, whether it's a natural death from chronic use of drugs over years and years that wears down the body, we only die for a couple different reasons. And it's because our brain stops giving messages for the body to do its job, or the heart stops, or the lungs stop. That's it. So what happened here? Even with like exsanguination, where someone bleeds out, it's still a cardiac related thing. The heart's doing its job, but it can't really continue doing its job because there's no return of that circulation. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a very simple thing. But with overdose, and especially with an acute overdose, which means an acute situation means overdose at that time. Chronic means years and years and years of wear and tear from use of whatever, whether it's alcohol, whether it's cocaine, heroin, whatever. That creates so much damage internally that we call that a natural death if the levels are appropriate at the time of death, the chemical levels. It's difficult to say which of those things is the predominant cause, which is the one thing. What happened first? Was it that the brain stroked out? Was it that the heart stopped because it was a stimulus overload? Was it the lungs couldn't do their job because they were full of fluid and foam and whatnot? It kind of all happens kind of at the same time.
Yeah, I never thought about that. It's true. Well, I'd like to just kind of finish with one question, a little more personal, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
As we're sitting here talking about these things, you're able to discuss them so matter-of-factly, but, for people that go through these things, they can be life-changing. And I'm just curious, how do you deal with seeing death on a daily basis and keep your sanity, I guess, or
well, wait a minute. Who said I was saying somebody's lying out there?
Not let it affect you negatively.
It does occasionally. There are cases that bother me immensely, and I think those are more associated to things that I've been through in my life. But sexual assault cases are the ones that send me in a tailspin, and I wonder what I'm doing and who I'm helping at that point, especially because I only deal with the death portion, and so I can't help that person anymore other than to be a voice and an advocate and to tell their story. For me, I pray Isaiah 6:8 every single morning, every single work morning, and basically I'm like, here I am, Lord, send me. I never know what I'm walking into. I know that for me to have a job, there has to be a terminal event, and that's it. I don't know if it's going to be a celebration that this person's no longer in pain. I don't know if it's going to be something horrid and tragic that somebody's 16-year-old was driving too fast and lost control. I don't know if it's the 97-year-old grandpa who is dying alone because he's also a registered sex offender. And, I don't know what those details will be for that day. But I know who goes before me. I know who is supporting me on all sides. I know who's got my back. So for me, it's 110% faith-based. And I have talked to God quite a bit about how the day that I am no longer doing his work or feeling like I'm working in the capacity of a ministry, I know it's for the sheriff's department. And fortunately, we have a really, really good fella in the position of sheriff right now.
Oh yeah,
a
he's
godly
great.
A godly man, but
hopefully our next governor.
I hope so. But I have worked for others who were not, but the theme is the same. As long as I feel like I'm serving the higher authority than even my boss, the sheriff, then I'm doing what God wants me to do. I keep wanting him to want me to do something different. I keep trying to convince God.
Release you from this?
Yes, right. There are believers in my office, but I wouldn't say that we have a lot of practicing Christians. And so I have one colleague and I are very supportive and prayerful for each other. And it's funny because the other ones who call me Mary Poppins or they call me Pollyanna and they, say things like, you always come in here so happy. And I'm like, no, I'm not happy. I'm full of joy. This is a sad place to be. But I have deep, unspeakable joy, and there's only one source of that. So those ones that like to kid about how, how naive or innocent or whatever I may appear, those are the ones who catch me by myself in a separate room and say, hey, can you pray for me? Yeah. Can you pray with me? Because they see the peace of God on me. And so it is by no strength or ability of my own. It is 110% all God all the time.
That's awesome. Well, Nicole, thanks for coming in and giving us a glimpse into this world that most people don't have, and shedding some light, from the tragic side of addiction, and helping us and our listeners, understand that, there's a dark side of addiction that you don't come back from.
Right.
And
it affects everyone.
Absolutely.
And so we really have to be cognizant and empathetic. You never know who's struggling around you. And I don't, there's an old phrase that says she's driving me to drink. I never want to be the cause of somebody feeling like they've had that kind of a day. So it doesn't cost me anything to be kind or loving or compassionate to someone at all. And if it points them towards Jesus, all the more better.
Well, thanks, Nicole. We need more of that in our world.
Yes, we do.
All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being a part of this much-needed conversation as we expose the raw truths about addiction. Don't forget to like, follow, and most importantly, share. Remember, addiction is the dirty little secret that every family deals with, but nobody wants to talk about.